Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Technology doesn't stop at national borders, and increasingly neither can regulation. A new U.S. U.K. effort to coordinate oversight of tokenized finance highlights the challenge of creating rules for markets that are still taking shape. Joining me to discuss it is John Kearney, Director of Product Management at MyComplianceOffice. John, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Great to be here, Terry.
Recently, the U.S. and the United Kingdom unveiled what they're calling a joint roadmap to coordinate digital asset oversight. Before we jump into the whys and wherefores of that, can I ask you for a very quick primer on those digital financial assets and what people are calling tokenization?
Yep. So tokenization, it's a whole new frontier. It's, I'll give you an example. We're all very familiar with stocks, say Tesla stock, for instance, and you can currently buy that at any brokerage in the US or in the UK, for instance. But there's been a change in that where we're now taking those stocks where firms are custodying that one security that you're talking about, and then they're issuing a token for that. The big benefit of that, of course, is that you can then trade that 24/7, right? So it's a tokenized security, and it has a whole load of new capabilities because of that. So that's really, the premises of tokenizations. You can take one asset and you can tokenize it, and you can then trade it 24/7 or internationally.
That movement of the financial markets to a 24/7 global continuous market is really a change. And in this case, why is it so important, or what's significant about the United States and the UK deciding to coordinate their approach to tokenized finance?
Well, I mean, what's really significant about it is that, typically when any new regulations come out, they're typically in one jurisdiction, right? This is two jurisdictions, probably the two biggest jurisdictions when it comes to, I would say, the securities markets are coming together and coordinating, what they're going to do before they really put their frameworks in place around how they're going to deal with tokenized assets. So that's alignment allows them to have standardization across both regimes, instead of trying to come together after the fact, which, typically is hard to do and, typically ends up with a lot more costs coming into play if you're trying to retrofit something after you've put regulation in place in two different jurisdictions.
Right. Very much going back to that 24/7, anywhere, anytime open market. If the U.S. and the U.K. didn't coordinate, if they took different approaches to regulating this kind of financial asset, what would be the consequences? Would firms sort of gravitate to whichever market had the most favorable regulations?
That's a very good question. Mostly no, I would say. Look, the large firms are already duly regulated. They can't really pick one. What you would probably see on the fringes is certain firms going to the less regulated one. But in general, what the end result would probably be that firms would end up having to have two approaches to how to handle regulation and compliance. And, there'd be extra costs that would come with that. So, for instance, in the industry we're in, where we're managing employee conflicts of interest, it would result in firms either trying to manage, how they monitor digital assets in the UK in one way and doing it slightly differently in the US. Or what some firms do is they tend to implement the most stringent restrictions. And, the end result of that, of course, is that individuals who are innocently then getting hit with the harder restriction just because they happen to be in the jurisdiction that has the less stringent controls in place.
John Kearney is Director of Product Management at MyComplianceOffice. John, one of the questions that comes to my mind here, especially a challenge for regulators, is that this arena is really evolving, and it's evolving quickly. As you're trying to set regulation, is there enough certainty for markets at this point, or do you risk over-regulating at a time when you're not quite sure which direction it's going?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my take on this is, the answer is yes and no, I guess, right? But my approach to this is really, for regulators to really put in principles rather than putting strong rules in place early on and then potentially add in those rules as more certainty comes into what's happening. Also, focusing in on regulating the function or behavior and not really focusing in on the technology ends up with less risks that you'll have problems later. So in the business we're in, right, conflicts of interest, a conflict of interest, exists, whether it's tokenized security or whether it's a traditional financial asset. So, the fact that somebody could have insider information and trade on it, that's still going to exist with tokenized securities as it did with traditional assets. And, the approach should be to focus in on the conflict of interest and not what way it was. It happened.
Are there certain principles or assumptions that you're seeing made right now in this joint policy statement that might be at risk because of the rate of change of the technology and the products here?
So on this, look, I think the way they're focusing on this, the approach here is that they're very much focused in on, I would say, items that are not that controversial. Like they're focused in on what I would say is the boring areas of finance, which are things like settlement. So I think there's probably not a huge amount of risk that they're going to end up putting something in place that they're going to have a problem with. I think what they're doing is fairly smart. It's an area where I think they'll all potentially be able to agree because it's something that is kind of the basis of how the financial markets work. So I'm not concerned that we're going to have a problem there.
We're talking a little bit about the complexity of international agreements on this sort of framework and rules for financial markets. What is the role of the private sector here? How are the banks and the financial industry coming in and providing input? Are they into this conversation?
Yeah, well, I think in the U.S., we're seeing a strong debate around the Clarity Act. We've got lots of different voices coming into play, and I think that's healthy, to be honest. I know it's been quite fractious in some cases, and a lot of people have strong opinions, but, I think that's healthy, and it's something that has to happen, that people air their voices. And that is happening, in the U.S. with the private sector. And I think what really works there is if you have transparency, you bring in as wide an audience as you possibly can. You bring in, the technology providers, the large players, the small, the medium players, you get their input and, you make it public so that, there's transparency in place and everybody can see what inputs are being put into the debate and where it ends up.
Certainly here in the U.S., there's a lot of tension always between the regulators and the market players themselves, and we think that that's a good thing, but there's always room for going back and forth. I'm not nearly as familiar with the U.K. markets, but I will assume that that's a characteristic of those markets as well. How, if you're a regulator, do you stay close enough to industry developments to write these kinds of workable rules without really allowing the industry to effectively write the rules itself?
Yeah, so look, I think a lot of it is taking, the regulators taking an approach as to what their objective is out of it. From the side of it that I'm coming from, it's conflicts of interest. It's the regulators' role, in my opinion, is to make sure that there's transparency and fairness in the market. So their objective should be to make sure that that's what happens. How it works in practice is what you're going to get from the players. So we should be looking to them to actually provide the information on that. And then the regulators provide what the objective is. And, going back to what I was saying, keeping transparency there, recording what everybody said, what their inputs were, and, keeping everybody honest through that transparency, I think is a key to the whole approach.
This seems like a very foundational document and agreement. If it plays out, what do you expect to see in this tokenization space a couple of years from now? Will we have built on this foundation? Will we have changed it completely? What's going to happen to the market?
I think it provides, the opportunity for cross-border tokenized securities to work, right, without needing a legal opinion on, what happens in the UK, what happens in the US, and just transparency on that, and also consistency on that, so that people know how it's going to work. I think it'll be good from the industry from that point of view. It'll also provide clarity to the market around things like, what is a security, what's not a security. That's been pretty vague for the last few years, not just in the US, but also worldwide. From the industry that we're in and the customers that we have, provides the opportunity to just have one control framework, not two in place, to be able to standardize the controls you have in place around conflicts of interest and not have multiple controls, which are costly to keep. And I suppose, look, the reality is, if in 5 years' time, when we come back and look at this, if a compliance team is able to just have one control or remove one control from what they had to have in the past because these two jurisdictions came together, that would be a good thing.
I've been speaking with John Kearney, Director of Product Management at MyComplianceOffice. John, I really appreciate you giving us a practitioner's eye into what's a really complicated issue. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much, Terry. Really appreciate talking to you, and wish all your listeners a happy future with digital assets.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.